Today's presentation will talk about hydrocarbon refrigerants, in particular R290 and its introduction into True's commercial product line. We at True would like to welcome and thank you for your participation in this presentation. The agenda for the presentation is as follows. We will review the history of R290, then talk about its advantages, then review the significant new alternative policy, talk about safety as it relates to that policy, then talk specifically about service procedures as it relates to True's equipment, and then review. Before we get started, let me ask you a question. Which of these items do you think has the most propane in it? A can of spray paint has twice as much propane as a GDM-10. Are you surprised? The history of R290. Hydrocarbon-based refrigerant is not new. In fact, in Europe, South America, and Asia, they have been using R290 for more than 20 years, with more than 70 million units in the field. True has been producing as well as shipping cabinets to Europe for quite some time now. On February 21st of 2012, the EPA approved the use of hydrocarbon refrigerants in the United States. In particular, two types: R290 propane for the use in commercial refrigeration, and R600A isobutane for its use in residential refrigeration. The hydrocarbon advantages. In comparison to 134A and R404A, R290 has a very low global warming potential. Hydrocarbons are a natural occurring refrigerant, which means they are naturally produced that contain zero ozone depletion potential, which is very important in today's green agenda. What is the Significant New Alternative Policy, or SNAP as we refer to it? The SNAP policy has a very strict set of guidelines that must be followed. The policy is written for new equipment only, may not be used to retrofit any existing equipment. There are charge limitations in the amount of refrigerant that can be used, with these limitations being 5.3 ounces or 150 grams of R290. The SNAP policy requires special marking and labeling and states that all commercial equipment produced in the U.S. must meet UL 471 standard that includes section SB, which is specific to the use of flammable refrigerants. There are also a set of standards in place for equipment going outside of the U.S., as you can see. Now let's look at the special marking required, starting with the process tubes. All of the refrigerant line process tubes must be marked in a PMS number 185 red sleeve. These additional labels are located on the cabinet. There are two on the back side of the cabinet and one on the evaporator cover, and of course the main serial tag inside the cabinet. We will now look at the labeling on the compressor. Should you receive a compressor and/or a condensing unit that does not look like the original one that was in the cabinet, please do not install it and call True immediately. The EPA is not requiring specialized training, but they do recommend it. We have put together this training program in conjunction with RSES's current program. On June 23, 2014, the EPA approved the venting of hydrocarbon refrigerants. R290 service safety as outlined by the EPA, RSES, UL, and True. When it comes to diagnosing any refrigeration system, there can be no shortcuts. A failure to comply could result in serious injury. When working in the refrigeration system, it is recommended that good refrigeration practices be followed. It is important to keep in mind that this type of refrigerant has the potential to be flammable and/or explosive, so please keep this in mind when working on this cabinet. This chart shows the boiling point of R290. Notice that it falls between R134A and R404A. Also, the refrigerant safety classification for each refrigerant is given. You can see that R290 is classified as an A3 refrigerant. This chart shows you how the refrigerants get their safety classifications. Some of the electrical components used in these cabinets will require special approvals based on their locations within the cabinets. It is important that only OEM parts are used in any of the cabinets containing a hydrocarbon-based refrigerant. Here you can see the wire connectors that we are currently using. The wires just push into the wire connector as shown by the picture on the left. The bottom picture on the right shows a spring-loaded positive pressure connector that you will need to use a tool to release the wire. The top picture on the right shows a lever-type connector. You could see both types of wire connectors in the cabinets. It is important to note that should you have to change out an electrical connector, that you replace it with one of these type of connectors. Should you have any questions about this, please do not hesitate to contact True. This is the compressor relay. Notice how the relay on the right is more enclosed. Next, we're looking at the temperature control. The major difference between the two is the contact points. Notice the control on the right, the contact points are enclosed. This is a picture of the condenser fan motor. Notice how the entire motor body is enclosed. This motor has a sealed shaft and uses a ball bearing instead of a sleeve bearing to reduce friction. You should have noticed a common theme when looking at all these components. Enclosing the components reduces the presence of an ignition source. When working on any R290 cabinet, you should always use a combustible gas meter. The combustible gas meter will also double as a leak detector designed to detect propane. We will be stocking these meters should you have any need to purchase an additional one. It is suggested that you contact True for current pricing for this meter. Some other general precautions you should be aware of. Gases and liquids, when released under atmospheric pressure, can cause freezer burn if the refrigerant comes in contact with any bare skin. Also, like all other refrigerants released in the confined area, the refrigerant will displace the air. This is another reason why it's important to work in a well-ventilated area. True service procedures. These are procedures that need to be followed when working on any True manufactured equipment. Be sure to work in a well-ventilated area. This will assure that any concentrations of R290 that may have escaped will have minimal chance of igniting. You will need a tank of oxygen-free dry nitrogen with proper relief and regulating valve on it. You will of course need some R290 and a special process valve for your propane tank. A note about the propane. Should you be acquiring propane on your own, be sure it's refrigerant grade propane, which is not the same as you would use to operate your outdoor grill. Refrigerant grade propane does not contain any additives in it and has a lower moisture content. We will also have propane available should you not be able to obtain it locally. You will need some type of pinch-off tool. These are pictures of two different types of pinch-off tools. This pinch-off tool will be your primary means to seal the ends of the refrigerant process tubes in the refrigeration system. This is a picture of the warning sign that we will be providing. It is recommended that you post this warning sign in an area that you're working in. Picture here is the R290 service kit that we have put together. The kit contains a combustible gas meter, a 1-pound tank of refrigerant grade propane, a charging valve, 2 short hoses, a pinch-off tool, and a warning sign. If you are interested in purchasing this kit, please contact True's Parts Department for pricing. Should you be working on a hydrocarbon cabinet and feel it best to capture the refrigerant, we do offer an optional capture system. For details on this, please contact True's Technical Service Department. When working with any type of refrigerant, we strongly recommend that you follow good refrigeration practices. Most of these practices are not new and things we currently should be applying when working on the refrigeration system. Always be sure that it is necessary to tap into the sealed refrigeration system. Use your thermometer to assess how the cabinet is operating. If it is determined that you need to tap into the refrigeration system, this is where and how you should install your temporary line taps. You will need to gain access to the condensing unit. Next, locate the high and low side process tubes. Then, trim back some of the red plastic tubing covering these lines as shown in these pictures. Be sure to leave yourself plenty of room at the end of each process line. When installing your gauges, be sure to use as short a hose as possible. It is also recommended that your hoses incorporate some type of shutoff valve or are self-sealing. After you install your gauges, be sure to purge the air from them. When evacuating the refrigeration system, we require the use of a micron gauge. The system should be evacuated to a minimum of 500 microns. It is a good practice, regardless of the refrigerant, to have a CO2 or dry powder type fire extinguisher handy, should the case arise to need one. Again, as a service person, it is always good to be familiar with the equipment and its operation, and when at all possible, we strongly encourage you to disconnect the power to the cabinet. Always turn on your combustible gas meter / leak detector when entering the area where the cabinet is. It is extremely important to maintain good ventilation in the service area. Be sure to eliminate any or all ignition sources. You should also keep in mind that you may be creating temporary flammable zones with your hose connections on your manifold as well as your vacuum pump. Should you need to remove a component in the refrigeration system, it is recommended that you cut the defective component out. The reason for this should be obvious. If the refrigeration system still has refrigerant present and you're using a torch, you are supplying an ignition source to the refrigerant. Additionally, if the refrigeration system is contaminated and you're supplying a heat source, you could spread the contamination throughout the refrigeration system. Be sure that you have tight connections on your vacuum pump, micron gauge, line taps, and your gauges. Pressurize the system to no more than 200 pounds. You will then want to leak check using bubbles or your combustible gas meter. When brazing, we strongly recommend that you purge nitrogen through the refrigeration system. It is now time to charge the system. Be sure to weigh in the charge and leak check again. Prior to removing your high side gauge, be sure to bleed its contents back through the manifold and into the low side. This picture shows where the pinch-off tool should be placed to seal the system prior to removing your gauges. The process tube can now be sealed, brazing it shut. When working on any of the electrical components within the cabinet, it's a good idea to disconnect the power to the unit. Should any of the electrical components need to be replaced, be sure to use only OEM parts. Be sure to monitor the area. Be sure you're working in a well-ventilated area. Be sure to eliminate all potential ignition sources and be sure to use only OEM parts. Should you have any questions, concerns when making any of these repairs, please stop and contact us at True. Again, we at True would like to thank you for your time and participation.